Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 6, Halacha 4. This is part 2 of the Shir. In the Art Scroll, we're on 60a1. Today we're covering disruptions of the Aris. And this is literally what the Mishnah says. This is going to be, by the way, the Aris that is destroyed in the middle, and there are going to be 5 vines on one side of a gap and 5 vines on the other side of the gap. And initially, as we were covering in part 1 of the Shir, this is talking about an 11-vine vineyard that gets cut into half and made into 2 vineyards. Now, there are some mathematical things here that come up, like what happens if you have a 9-vine vineyard. That's going to be an Aris, and the vine in the middle, that would be the 5th vine, is destroyed, and now you have 4 vines over here and 4 vines over here, and this gap in the middle. Well, that's not going to be really an Aris. That's just going to be some individual vines put onto a fence, and that is going to now have the law of being a set of individual vines. And what we covered before in earlier parts of chapter 6 is that an Aris has to have at least 5 vines to qualify. That's why the minimum measure to get this to work for the destroyed vineyard is going to be 11 vines, and 1 is destroyed in the middle. Now, something, as we covered in the first part of the shir, that comes up that is an unusual part that really doesn't leave a question to get resolved is going to be this idea of the measurement itself as this unusual thing in Torah law. And that's going to be that ordinarily lengths are going to be whole numbers. There's an exception with Erevin, but anyway, that's going to be that fraction is going to end up being a pretty large number for the fraction. But over here, for the length of the measurement, it's going to be 8 amos and a bit, and that bit is going to be a tefach. And this really just occurs only here in Jewish law. The Vilna Goan says it's a heckish for other things in Jewish law, but that's not how the halacha goes by. And it's going to be basically that this is just going to be a rule just for the Aris, and that's what's unusual about it. Now, if you had the gap in the middle between this set of vines and that set of vines, we covered this before in chapter 4, that's going to be 8 amos. And that if you have greater than 8 amos, you can make a little bit of a gap in the middle, and that's going to be the idea by Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai is going to add a 50% gap in there that you have to add on top of it. So this is basically going to be saying it's like 12 amos instead of 8 amos. But if you have this gap that's going to be greater than 8 amos for a regular karam, then you can plant some foreign seed in the middle part of this burnt out vineyard. Again, this is going to cover a few different things that we were covering. One is going to be that, we don't want things being surrounded. There's a phobia that's been coming up throughout all of Kilayim about having crops be surrounded, especially on many sides. And another thing that comes up is this principle of subordination that chapter 6 has been playing with this entire time. That's going to come up later on in this year more about the principle of subordination, where one thing is going to be primary, and then you're going to have these other, minor things that you don't necessarily desire, and that's going to come up more with the fences. So over here with this disruption of the Aris, again, we're dealing with what's destroyed in the middle, and now they want to have, you've effectively split this into 2 vineyards, and you want to plant in the middle. And it's going to now define what is the disruption of the Aris. And the Gemara explains. It says that there's no difference whether he first built the wall or the trellis, and then he planted his 11 vines, which he trained onto the wall, or whether he planted 11 vines, like a carom, which is going to be on the ground, and then he built a wall or a trellis, and then he trained the vines on after he put up the wall. And in either case, when the middle vine becomes severed, in both cases, before the middle vine is severed, here is an Aris. And hence, after the middle vine is separated or destroyed, this is going to be the disruption of the Aris. In other words, what this is saying is that you had an 11-vine vineyard. That's going to be your Aris. It's going to be a single vineyard. And after the middle vine is severed, whether you planted it this way in the beginning and then you put these up onto the wall, or whether you had the other case where you built the wall and then you planted the vines and then you hung these up onto it, whether the wall was there before or after, once this is trained onto the wall, it turns on and gets a halachic status of the Aris. And the idea is, well, what happens if the wall gets destroyed, right? In other words, what this is saying is, no matter which order you have it, where these vines, whether they were planted first or the wall came after, and it gets put up onto the wall, it now becomes an Aris. It is not a kerem anymore. And the Gemara says that if the wall is now destroyed while all the vines are intact, there is no longer over here an Aris. And if the wall was destroyed after the middle vine is severed, there is no longer a disruption of the Aris. In other words, what this is trying to say is that, in either case, if the wall is destroyed, it's either going to be an Aris or it's not going to be an Aris. And the following ruling is basically going to be saying, like, look, the wall is completely destroyed. And although you had 11 vines that were initially trained on the wall, and this would establish as an Aris, now that the wall is destroyed, it's losing its Aris status. And the Chazan Ish in his Kilayim 12:21 is saying that now that the wall is destroyed, it loses the Aris status, and it is considered a single row of vines that is going to be like a kerem on the ground. And as we know, that is not going to constitute a vineyard. Again, if we have 5 vines in a row, that is not a vineyard. That is Bet Shammai's vineyard. But the point is that the vines constitute an Aris only when they are trained on the wall. And that's what this is playing with. Whether they are no longer on the wall, then they're going to lose the Aris status. And even if the wall exists, but the vines are taken off, they're no longer going to be considered an Aris. So let's say you had the wall and somebody just took off all of the vines from it and put it back onto the ground like a kerem. That now has the legal status of a kerem. It doesn't have the legal status of the Aris anymore. Now, if these are 5 vines in a row and you took the vines off of the wall, not only is this not an Aris anymore, but it's also not a vineyard anymore. This is now a collection of 5 individual vines. Now, if you had one form of a crooked Aris where you had 2 and 3 and you hung this over, that would be an Aris. And if you took these vines off where it was 2 and 3 with a tail looking like Bet Hillel's, this would now be a vineyard that's a kerem, so that it is on the ground, but also have the halachic status of a vineyard. It means that you need to have 4 amos for separations and things like that. But the key here is that what is going to be an Aris? Well, it has to be on the wall. And if you take it off the wall, it's not an Aris anymore. And if you destroyed the wall, and then that is a disruption where it, let's say for you just took off the wall and now the vines are, not on the wall anymore. Does that have the halachic status of Aris? No, it's not on the wall anymore. So it is now going to be a kerem. Now, what happens if you have this on a wall and you cut the middle vine? That now is going to be the disruption of the Aris. And again, that's what's going to be different about this set of halachot, is that when you have this disruption of the Aris, again, it's 8 amos plus a tefach, and you are measuring for that 1 tefach being the branch, the root, the base of the trunk of the tree that is now cut down. So before, when you have a vineyard, you are taking a vineyard, you're separating vine to vine by 4 amos. But over here, what's unusual about this law, and again, this is only coming up for the Aris, and it's unclear why it has 8 amos and a tefach. If you have a regular vineyard, it's going to be 4 amos between a vine, 4 amos with a vine, and then 4 amos, and then you have another vine. And if you take out the middle vine, if it's a kerem, it's just going to be 8 amos. You're not going to include the space for the trunk. But over here you do, and we just don't know why. Now, there's a lot of things in oral law that you sort of say, like, well, why is it going to be like that? For instance, one of the things that's going to be is like with a tefach, when you have an overhang for a roof and for things that are going to be like temeh and an ochel, and the minimum measure on some of those things in some cases is going to be a tefach. So why is that going to be? I don't know why. A lot of the measurements were given by Halacha Moshe Sinai. It's unclear whether this one rule on the Aris for this extra tefach, for this disruption of the branch, why that space of that branch is included in the count. It's unclear why that is, and that might just be something that's lost to time. But again, as we saw in the end of part 1 of this shiur, that the question that Rabbi Yonah is probing at is really left unanswered. And it might be unanswered because we're not sure why, or maybe the answer is so obvious and it's just beyond me. And again, all of the rules in chapter 6 with karems are a little bit difficult because, all of the halachot are sort of murky. Like we've been studying so far about the vineyards of Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, and one is going to say that this is a vineyard and that one's not a vineyard, and vice versa. But once you put it onto a wall, they'll both agree, oh, that's a vineyard. And that's kind of the novelty in chapter 6, halacha 1, right? Part of the way to read it is that you're saying, well, if you have 5 vines in a row and you now put this onto a wall, by Bet Shammai, that was a vineyard, and by Bet Hillel, that's not a vineyard. But now, by Bet Hillel, once you put it onto a wall, it has the halachic status of a vineyard, and it's a karem. It's not a karem, but it has a halachic status of a vineyard. And now when you have the crooked Aris in a zigzag, or even like Bet Hillel's vineyard, Bet Shammai says, well, that's not a vineyard. But now once you put it up onto a wall, well, now that turns onto a vineyard. That's what's so unusual about it. So there's a lot of unusual things here going on with the Aris. And again, the question is, what about the wall, right? And the key idea about this Gemara is once you've put it onto the wall, it now has a status of the vineyard. And once you take it off the wall, it loses it, even if the wall is still there. And once the vine is severed, that is going to have the halachic status of a vineyard. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, Rabbi Avudmi, the brother of Rabbi Yossi, wanted to say that if the wall was destroyed while all the vines were intact, so, okay, the vines are there, and now guess what? It's a karem, right? There's no wall. So the Gemara continues and says that he rebuilt it. You can certainly say that the Aris has returned to its place. In other words, it was an Aris, then they didn't destroy the middle vine, right? They didn't destroy some of the vines in the middle to make them individual vines. No, just the wall was destroyed. But they built a new wall. And once, it was an Aris, now that there's no wall, it's not an Aris, it's just a karem, they're on the ground. Now you built a new wall. Well, the halachic status of the karem returns. That's what he's saying. And although not as simple as the same can be applied in the same case where, it's rebuilt after the middle vine is severed, in that case as well, the disruption of the Aris is returned to its place. And in other words, it's a little bit convoluted, but what he's basically saying is, look, let's say you have your 11 vines and the 6th vine got cut, and you have, really now like 2 Arisim, right? You have 5 here and 5 here, and these are collected as 2 different vineyards instead of 1 vineyard. Well, what happens if you planted and so we say, oh, well, this is a disruption of the Aris, and now you got to go into this weird measurement of saying, well, from here to here, a separation between vineyard 1 and vineyard 2 on the Aris, that it's going to be 8 and a tefach distance before you can start to plant foreign seed between this Aris and that Aris. But what this is saying is what happens if you plant the vine again now in the middle to replace it? What happens? And what this is saying is this turns back onto the Aris. And in other words, this is an 11 vine Aris, and the disruption of the Aris goes away. And so you would have a problem before if you tried to plant foreign seed there. But instead, if you planted a new vine to replace it, it's going to count as a new vine, and it goes back to an 11 vine vineyard. And the whole thing about the disruption of the Aris and this weird 8 amos and 1 tefach thing goes away. The Gemara is going to talk about an interesting story that really is the only place this gets covered in chapter 6. In chapter 6, halacha 1 in the Mishnah, it talks about Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and he has the idea that if you put 5 vines over and you have a wall, depending on how far the wall is, it looks like you could have a reading where if it's going to be more than 4 amos away from the vines to the edge of the wall, that you could plant in some cases underneath the vines. And that's so far been a big hiddush, and it's been hanging over all of the parts of chapter 6. I mean, this has come up a few times now. What can you plant under, right? And so now we're going to get the conclusion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, according to Rabbi Yochanan, on what exactly is going on, where it looks like it could be possible to plant in some cases underneath vines for the Aris. And again, that so far has been hanging over chapter 6. We're going to get the conclusion of the story over here, why this was not put into chapter 6 halacha 1, I'm not sure, because again, it's been hanging over all the parts of chapter 6 so far. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that it once occurred that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri burned produce in Nagnigar. That's going to be, by the way, where he lived. And what did he burn? He burnt the trellised vines along with the produce of the foreign seed that was planted in a disruption of the Aris. So we learned here earlier that the disruption of the Aris, you may not plant if the gap is less than 8 amos and a tefach. And according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who burned his produce in this incident, if the gap would be 8 amos and a tefach, then planting would be permitted after you distance it 6 tefachim from each Aris. This, by the way, is where you're saying, okay, you're saying, between Aris 1 and Aris 2, all you have to do is set back 6 tefachim. And in this case, if foreign seed was planted 6 tefachim from each Aris in this gap, and this would be less than 8 amos and a tefach, so far it looks like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri has not been accepting this idea of the 8 amos and a tefach. In other words, he's going by, all you need is really just 6 tefachim, because it's like these are individual vines. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is ruling that not only is it forbidden to plant there in the first place, but illegal planting is going to render the produce forbidden, and all the produce has to be burned. That's effectively what his actions are showing. But we want to dissect exactly what's going on, because it's unclear. Now, again, when we go back to chapter 6 halacha 1, there's a dispute whether a single row of these trellised vines, this Aris, is going to be a vineyard. And according to the accepted view, it is a vineyard. And that means that foreign seed can't be planted within the row. In other words, you can't plant between vine number 4 and vine number 5, or within 4 amos of it. But according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and the way we've been reading it, it does not, and planting is permitted after you just distance it 6 tefachim. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that the Aris is not a vineyard. And so it's just a collection of 5 vines. And all you have to do is separate 6 tefachim. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri does agree that the area between the Aris and the wall can't be planted unless there is a 4 amos space between this wall and the Aris. In other words, underneath these vines. And in this case, foreign seed, if it was planted 6 tefachim away from the trellis vines of this Aris, and if it's going to be less than the 4 amos space between the Aris and the wall, that's going to be an illegal act, even according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri ruled that this illegal planting is rendering the produce forbidden, says the Mara Fulda, and all the produce must be burned. So what we see here is like, look, if you have the individual vines and you have a wall, okay, once you have the space between the vines and the wall, something special happens here, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that within this 4 amma gap, you can't plant anything there. But he's saying it's not a vineyard. It's just a collection of vines. So on the north side of these vines, or the south side of the vines, or the side opposite away from the wall, if you want to separate and plant a new set of field, you can set back by 6 tefachim. Why? Because you don't have to set back 4 amos from there, because it's just going to be a collection of vines. But what he's conceding to is that there's something special that happens with vines that now have this space between the vine itself and the wall, and especially if you're overhanging it. And within that, 4 amma gap, you have to have 4 amma that you can't plant underneath there. Now, if it's going to be 5 amma between these vines and the base of these trunks and the wall, and it's hanging over there, then Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying, well, it's just 4 amos. So that extra amma that you can plant within the extra amma. So that's a big hiddush, because now it looks like you've been planting underneath vines. And the other case that he's saying is, well, these are just going to be individual vines. And so, you can't just do a setback between, 6 tefachim between these vines and the wall, because that's not enough. You need something special with the 4 amos. That's basically the point of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and this has been hanging over all of this because, again, it came up in chapter 6, halacha 3. Can you plant underneath these vines and under this trellis or not? So it looks like, if you're going to read it like how it's been introduced without this new information in this Gemara, that you can, in certain circumstances, if it's going to be longer than 4 amos, plant, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And again, that is not going to be halacha. But again, what is going on with the story? Why is it that he's burning the produce? That's the chiddush here, right? And so the Gemara is going to continue, and Rabbi Yossi says that I asked in the presence of Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha and said, according to my version of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri burning his produce in the disruption of the vineyard, that's fine. In other words, why did Rabbi Yochanan relate the incident? And the Gemara is going to explain this, because again, we're left with this big question mark of, can you plant in certain circumstances underneath vines? So why did Rabbi Yochanan tell this incident? And this is to exclude, says this Amorah, the view of the sages who are at odds with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in this matter. What is the matter? This, by the way, is going to be talking about where you have, the disruption of the Aris, and, can you, plant foreign seed there, and is illegal planting in the part of the gap that is going to be 6 tefachim away from the Aris on either side. Is that going to render the produce forbidden? Rabbi Yochanan is going to be relating this incident to teach that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is disputing the ruling that came up earlier, that illegal planting in the area does render produce forbidden. And in this case, the produce must be burnt. So again, now it looks like, according to Rabbi Yochanan, we're cleaning this up in order to figure out if it's possible between the vines and the wall, if it's going to be greater than 4 amos to plant underneath the vines at all. So there's 2 versions of this. There's also going to be Rabbi Hia's version, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri burned the produce and planted in between an Aris and a wall. And why did Rabbi Yochanan relate this incident? It's to exclude the view of the sages who are at odds with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And the idea is that, they're trying to teach this for 2 different reasons. And, the sages are in agreement that foreign seed planted between an Aris and a wall has to be burnt. But again, what we see here from chapter 6, halacha 1, the sages are disputing Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and they're going to be actually more stringent than Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who's going to be holding, the sages are going to be saying that a 5-vine vineyard is a vineyard, and you have to separate 4 amos from it. And by the way, Yochanan ben Nuri says it's not. You have to distance 6 tefachim from it, except for the space between the wall and the vineyard. On the other sides, you can separate 6 tefachim. So the idea is going to be that, is it going to be where, the sages are going to agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that planting is forbidden between the Aris and the wall when the space between it is going to be less than 4 amos. And yeah, everybody's going to agree that, you can't plant underneath the space, certainly if it's going to be 4 amos or less. But what happens if it's going to be 4 amos or more? Are you going to have to burn that produce because it's going to be a Kilayim issue. So the Gemara is going to reject this argument by how Rabbi Hia is trying to look at this, and is going to promote Rabbi Yochanan's version about why is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri burning this produce. And again, these are Amorim trying to figure out why a Tana is doing something. So the Gemara is going to say that from the fact that Rabbi Yossi asked this question, it's obvious that he did not hear that Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish that they disagreed concerning the following matter. In other words, that these other Amorim, when they're looking at what exactly is the version of the story according to Rabbi Yochanan, or what exactly is the story according to Rabbi Hia, really what they're saying is that there's a maloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish about what exactly is happening with the story with this Tana, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who's burning the produce. Foreign seed planted within the Aris itself. And the question is actually also going to be posed later on in Kilayim chapter 7, Halacha 2. And it's basically going to be stating that initially it's forbidden to introduce foreign seed in the disruption of the Aris. In other words, this space between, one part of the Aris and the other part. Before it was all combined into one Aris, and now it's split into two. And now the question is, can you plant between these two vineyards? And the question is, what about a 6 tefach adjustment? Because, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying that, look, these are individual vines, it's not a vineyard. And so if you have 6 tefachim over here and 6 tefachim over here between the two vineyards, and you have more than that, well, you can plant a little strip of something else. But, here we see that he's coming out and burning all this stuff. So what exactly happened? And Rabbi Yochanan says about this that it is prohibited to plant foreign seed there, and doing so renders the produce forbidden. And what did Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish say? He said it's prohibited to introduce foreign seed there, but doing so does not render the produce forbidden. So this is going to be a case where Rabbi Yochanan is saying that only the space outside the Aris, in other words, between these now, two sets of vines that are going to now be, one vineyard that's split into two, and you're planting between the two. And in other words, it's not going to render the produce forbidden. But the space between the vines and the wall, as well as the space between the vines themselves, has the same stringency as the inside of a vineyard, and that's going to render produce forbidden if foreign seed is planted there. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is arguing something else. He's saying that everything beyond 6 tefachim surrounding each vine, including in any space that lies within the Aris, does not render the produce forbidden. And the Mara Fulda is insisting about this, that the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is not limited to within the Aris, but related to the entire prohibited area surrounding the Aris. And Rabbi Yochanan is maintaining that illegal planting anywhere within the prohibited 4 amos of an Aris, even beyond the vines of a 6 tefach work area, results in the produce being rendered forbidden. So when the Mishnah is stating that planting in the disruption of the Aris does not render the produce forbidden, it's referring to planting the less than 1 tefach area that's 4 amos away from the Aris on each side of the gap. And in other words, the sages are going to forbid planting over there. And, really, in light of this dispute between Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan about what is this Tana doing, it's understandable, according to Rabbi Hia's version, where Rabbi Yochanan is relating this Tana burning the produce planted in between the vines and the wall. Why is that? That's to exclude the position of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish that this planting is not rendered forbidden after the fact. And the Chazan Ish is going to explain about Rabbi Hia's version that Rabbi Yochanan is telling the story to bring proof to his opinion from the incident involving Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, where it can be seen that an illegal planting within the Aris, in other words, even between the vines and the wall, even if it's going to be, say, greater than 4 amos away, is going to render produce forbidden. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, he's going to basically be saying that it does not render produce forbidden, and it's going to go like Rabbi Yochanan. But really, why is this in here? Well, it looks to me like this is in here to preclude the position that we saw in chapter 6 halacha 1. What happens if you have vines and a wall, and it's going to be, say, 5 tefachim? Well, within the 5 amos. What happens within the 1 amos? Can you plant underneath those vines? And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri effectively is burning the stuff, according to Rabbi Yochanan, because it might have been done in that extra amma of space. And in other words, he's basically telling the story to preclude Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's version that you're not supposed to plant underneath that extra amma, if the vines are separated out instead of 4 amos away, but 5 amos away in that extra amma. But if you did it, you did it. And Rabbi Yochanan is relating that, no, he's out there burning it because it might have been under that extra amma. And now, basically he's trying to preclude the version of the story for Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Now, we get into the next part of what the Mishnah is talking about, and that's going to be where an Aris emerges from a wall. In other words, we're talking about the ends in the corner of a wall, and then, we have a wall and we have vines crawling along the wall. And what happens now if we reach the end of the wall and there's some vines that are going to be there? How far is your setback going to be before you can start to plant a new set of a new field? You want to plant some barley. So the Mishnah's ruling is going to be based on the assumption that this configuration of the trellis vines do not constitute a vineyard, and therefore, after you distance it 6 tefahim from the vines, planting is going to be allowed, but it's going to be qualified, right? Because again, we have this principle of subordination. The Gemara says that this permit to plant after distancing 6 tefachim from the vines is so, provided that there's a minimum of 4 tefachim in the corner. In other words, from where the vine is to the edge of this wall or the edge of this trellis. And in other words, that, where's the minimum measure of the domain going to be? In other words, if what's left of this trellis before the vine takes over the rest of the trellis at the end, if it's going to be less than 4 tefachim left, then you can't just set back 6 tefachim from the edge of the vine, and you're going to have to actually measure from the edge of the trellis and set back 6 tefachim from there. So, what's happening here? Well, 4 tefachim is going to be the space considered a significant area, and so, if the remainder of the wall only has 4 tefachim left that doesn't have a vine left on it, it's going to be seen as a distinct area and not subordinate to the vines. But and you'd be able to plant a 6 tefach work area, and you'd calculate it from the vines, not the end of the wall. But what Rabbi Kanievsky is saying, if the remainder of the wall before the vines overcome the rest of the wall is less than 4 tefachim, then that is subordinate to the vines, and the 6 tefachim work area is now going to be calculated from the end of the wall, not from the edge of the end of the vines. So, according to this explanation, says the Chazan Ish, the Tanna Kama is having a very similar view with what Rabbi Yossi says in the Mishnah. And while Rabbi Yossi is maintaining that the remainder of the wall must measure 4 amos, the Tanna Kama is holding that it's enough for the remainder of the wall to measure 4 tefachim. But again, in the other case, it gets back to what's subordinate. If most of the wall is covered by vines and there's only, say, like 2 tefachim left, well, you'd say that these 2 tefachim are subordinate to the vines. And so you're going to have to go to the edge of the wall, measure a new 6 tefachim from the edge of the wall, because you can't just say that, well, I can do 4 amos plus 2 amos and say from the edge of the vines, because again, the remaining gap of what's left on that trellis is subordinate. Again, that's that principle of subordination kicking in. So we're going to finish up with Rabbi Yossi's point, and then that will be the end of chapter 6. We'll get into chapter 7. So the Mishnah talked about the dissenting opinion concerning the Aris that's coming from a wall, and Rabbi Yossi said that if there are not 4 amos there, he may not introduce foreign seed there. And the Gemara is going to probe because we saw earlier that if we had a single vine inside of a pit or a hole or a cleft, and how far do you have to now in this new space set back before you can introduce foreign seed in there? He's saying that you have to set back 4 amos from this individual vine because it's enclosed on the walls, and after the 4 amos you can plant. Well, what's going to be going on over here with this ruling? Why are you also saying 4 amos over here? And is it going to be whether there's a wall there or not a wall? And that's what we're going to bump into. So the Gemara is going to say that we learned here in our Mishnah that according to Rabbi Yossi, a defined place occupied by a vine is considered the domain of the vine and can't be planted with a foreign species. And again, that's going to be similar to what we saw earlier. Rabbi Yossi is saying that if the remainder of the wall on which there are going to be 2 or 3 vines, and again, that's that L-shape pattern that we're talking about where there's 2 walls and there's 2 vines on this wall, 3 on this wall, then, if there's less than 4 amos, it's going to be subordinate to the vines and considered the domain of the vines, and then you can't plant foreign seed in there, even if the planting is just 6 tefachim from the actual vines. So the idea is that if you have this L shape, it looks like Rabbi Yossi is saying that if the space within the L is not at least 4 amos by 4 amos away, then the area within the L is subordinate to the vines, and so you can't plant foreign seed in there. In other words, you have to always be setting things back at least more than 4 amos away. And this is really implying that something special is happening with the Aris, that you can have these vines combining, and even though it's not in a straight line, that's the Hiddush here. But again, we're going to be seeing that, well, this is a lot like the ruling about what happens if we have the individual vine inside of the pit. And the Gemara is saying, and we learned in the very same teaching there with respect to the vine planted inside of the wine press or the cleft or the pit. And there too, Rabbi Yossi is arguing that unless this pit has a separation of at least 4 amos, it's going to be considered to be a domain of the vine, and foreign seed can't be planted there, even if it's going to be distanced 6 tefachim from the vine. And so in both cases, Rabbi Yossi is applying the same concept. And that's why this mission is necessary to teach Rabbi Yossi's position over here and over there. And it's going to, keep trying to look at Rabbi Yossi's position and say, had we learned it here and not learned it over there about the individual vine being inside of the pit, we might have mistakenly said that Rabbi Yossi's ruling applies only here. In other words, on the Aris with the 4 amos separation. And again, it's the whole point of the Gemara is going to try to connect these 2 rulings together to be consistent. That he's ruling over here that the vines have their own domain, and over here on the Aris that the vines have their own domain. You have to set back 4 amos. So from here, concerning the Aris, says the Gemara, it emerges that from the wall and within the corner, that because it is a case concerning which the laws of the Aris apply, you would say that it is prohibited. In other words, you're saying, look, chapter 6, everything we've been dealing with are these oddball rules of the Aris and how it's different from everything else. And you might have just said, well, this is just another oddball thing, and Rabbi Yossi's teaching, another oddball thing here because all of the laws of the Aris are odd. Okay, fine. And you would have said it's prohibited. Fine. But what about the one about the pit, and you have the individual vine in the pit? And again, he's also saying you have to set back 4 amos from there. And you might have said, well, over there, concerning the vine planted in the hole or the pit, and said, because it's not a case concerning the laws of the Aris, and you'd say it's permitted. In other words, you have an individual vine, and you could set back 6 tefachim. But Rabbi Yossi doesn't say that. Rabbi Yossi says, no, 4 amos for the individual vine inside of the pit. And so, basically, it's necessary to teach Rabbi Yossi permitting planting the foreign seed here in the Aris case, and also there in the hole. And, we might have learned, we might not have been able to tell this case from that case or that case from this case in order to know which is the halacha, because the rules of the Aris are different. And so we wouldn't necessarily be able to infer about the hole. In other words, why is that having to come up in, why did it have to come up in the Mishnah twice? and because you can't figure out A to B or from B to A because the rules of the Aris are different. And so you might have just said, well, that's just the rules of the Aris. So what? All the rules there are odd. So what? So we might have learned also, says this Gemara, that Rabbi Yossi's ruling there with respect to the grapevine planted in a pit and not learned over here with respect to the Aris coming from the wall within the corner. And we might have mistakenly said that Rabbi Yossi's ruling applies only there in the pit. In other words, we can't infer this from that because, again, the rules here are different. And the Gemara continues and says, over there concerning the vine planted in the press or the cleft, we couldn't infer over here from the ruling over here from the Aris because the area inside the hole is going to be enclosed on 4 sides. And the walls, over here, where you have the Aris, it's emerging that the wall is going to be with a corner. In other words, it's going to have 2 sides. And so you'd say, well, this one has 4 sides, this one has 2 sides. So maybe you can apply the law over here, but not over here, or vice versa. And the Gemara is saying because the area is confined by the Aris and not enclosed on all 4 sides, and it's L-shaped, you would say, oh, well, maybe it's permitted. In other words, the Gemara continues, says it's necessary to teach in the Mishnah here. In other words, they're teaching this case in the Mishnah in 2 cases. One is if you have it on open ground and it's L-shaped boards or L-shaped wall and it's not fully enclosed. And over here, this is going to be in a pit where it's enclosed on all 4 sides. And you have to teach it because you wouldn't get the law right if you only knew one of them. You need to know both of them, and that's why it has to come up twice. The Torah and the oral law does not like redundancy, and it likes things to be exact and efficient. But it's necessary to teach it here concerning the case of the Aris because Rabbi Yossi's planting a foreign seed is going to be necessary because you can't infer this from that. And that's why this is organized like this, says this Gemara. The Gemara says, if a shoot of one of the grapevines of the Aris protrudes beyond the trellis and it's going to extend beyond the Aris prohibited work area, we view it as though there's a plumb line that is hanging from underneath the shoot, and it's forbidden to introduce foreign seed there. Now, the Gemara is going to define it, and then we're going to be finished. And the Gemara defines the area in which foreign seed is prohibited. And there in Bavel, they say, you perceive the shoot as though a metal spit was inserted into it and prevent it from drooping down, and it is prohibited to plant foreign seed beneath the entire perceived length of that shoot. But the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon bar Ba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, says it is prohibited to introduce foreign seed only up to the point that the shoot droops down, not beneath the potential extended length of the shoot. So, in other words, by extending out how far this is, even if it's drooping and saying, well, there's a metal spit and it just continues, in Bavel, they're saying that it's forbidden to introduce foreign seed even in that extended area, even if it's not physically there and the plant is drooping. Now, according to Rabbi Shimon bar Ba, it's only prohibited to plant under the shoot itself in the natural state, and even if it's where it's drooping, you don't extend it out. That's what it is saying. And the Mishnah is going to forbid planting foreign seed directly beneath the protruding vine shoot or a vine stretched from tree to tree, even when the planting is outside the work area of the vine. And the Mishnah does not state whether the planting under the shoot or the branch is going to render the produce forbidden, and the Gemara is going to cite a dispute on this. The Gemara finishes up and says, Rabbi Chama bar Ukva says in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina that under the grape clusters of the protruding shoot, it is prohibited to plant foreign seed, and doing so renders the produce forbidden. But planting foreign seed beneath the actual shoot or its leaves does not render the produce forbidden. And Rabbi Yossi says even planting beneath the actual shoot or the leaves is prohibited, and doing so renders the produce forbidden. So the Pnei Moshe is understanding it like this, that, the Gemara is addressing the section of the Mishnah that forbids planting beneath a protruding shoot. And the Gemara is saying that, that regarding, this approach, between the vines themselves and the branches and the shoots and the leaves, that there's no question that illegal planting under the vine itself renders the produce forbidden. That's what the Mishnah says. The question is coming about illegal planting under the outgrowth of the vine. And Rabbi Yossi ben Hanina is holding that illegal planting under the branches of the leaves does not render the produce forbidden. Only the planting under the cluster of the grapes is going to do that. But Rabbi Yossi is arguing that planting under even the leaves or the branches is forbidden. And that's how we're going to end it up. And we're going to get into the difficulties of Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is going to be dealing with layering, and that's going to be where you're taking the branch and you're creating propagating new shoots and new grapevines. So Chapter 6 is difficult, and there's a lot of rabbinic laws in here. The Ravad is saying that the Aris itself is a vineyard d'Rabbanan. Some of the Tanaim are saying it's not a vineyard at all, but has these special rules. Rabbi Yossi holds that, for instance. And the sages are saying, no, it is a vineyard. And then you have the question about Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, and what looks like a novelty where it's not a vineyard at all might just be part of the novelty according to Bet Shammai or by Bet Hillel. And it's a difficult chapter, and there's a lot of questions because there's a lot of things that are missing that we don't have anymore, and we're not sure. We know what the halacha is, but exactly the argument between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel on all the parts there, we're not sure, and that's why it's in idios, because there's a lot of details that seem to be missing or unclear. And again, some of this might just be d'Rabbanan. It might be an argument where Bet Hillel is arguing that this is going to be a d'Rabbanan thing, and Bet Shammai might be arguing it's d'oraita. But again, there's special rules there, and the whole thing is covered with special rules. We're not sure why it's 8 amos and a tefach. We know that it is. We know that it covers the missing trunk. But why? It doesn't cover that in the other parts for the kerem that we saw in chapter 4. If you have the distance between the vines being 4 amos, okay, fine, and one vine in the middle is separated. Well, in a kerem on the ground, it's not 4 amos and a tefach. We don't count the vines. But here in the Aris, we do. Why? It's unclear. But this is why we go through the law. You know what the law is. You know that it's 8 and a tefach. That's the law. But how come? That we're not sure. Have a great day.